Sir, you can start. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. This is a webinar in the memory of Dr. Jayant Roy that ICRIER is very pleased to host. The topic of the webinar is Trade Policy and Reforms for Trade Facilitation, an Unfinished Agenda. We have a stellar panel and a moderator. Aditya Mattoo will be the moderator. There's Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Harsha, Singh, Bernard Hoekman, Sanjaya who will be the panelists, and then there will be comments invited by the audience from the floor. Normally, I would have sort of warmly welcomed all of you, but today I still welcome all of you. Thank you for joining. Not in a somber mood, but to celebrate a life well lived and a legacy of Dr. Jayant Roy that we will try and push through our research in ICRIER. Our hearts go out to the family and friends, his wife and children, who will naturally feel his absence, but I'm sure they'll remember the joys and the good times they spent with him. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here today, in his memory, celebrate his life as an economist. Just a personal experience that I had with Dr. Roy. I had just joined ICRIER as director in 2012, and my former boss, the late Dr. Ahluwalia, had negotiated a project with the ADB on regional integration. And I was asked to take charge of that project, which I happily did. I had just become director, as I said. This was around 2012-13. And there were several of us in ICRIER who were involved in that project. It was on value chains, regional value chains, global integration, trade policy reforms, as well as exports and manufacturing. I was involved as a researcher in one of the papers, and several of you present here from ICRIER were also involved in many of those papers. So when the time came for the inception report, we had to go to Manila to the ADB to present the inception report. And I remember all of us went there. The whole team from ICRIER was there at Manila presenting this report, the inception report. And, we all presented our reports and our first drafts. And then in the coffee break, this gentleman comes up to me and says, congratulations on becoming the director of ICRIER, and congratulations on your draft report. It's very nice. Of course, I knew who this person was, and I said, thank you, Dr. Roy. It's a pleasure to meet you. And he turns around to me and said, we're going to work a lot together, I'm sure, because ICRIER does a lot of work on value chains and trade facilitation. So don't call me Dr. Roy. Your brother calls me Jayantuda. And my brother, of course, Sanjay, who works in the World Bank, he said, your brother calls me Jayantuda. And so it was, Jayantuda from then onwards until I met him last in 2017 when he was in India. It has always been Jayantuda, and it was a pleasure really to know him. Jayantuda will be remembered as one of India's finest trade economists and policy practitioners. His passion, defense for free and fair trade and institutional reform has and will continue to provide guidance for those who work on trade and trade policy. He's had an illustrious career in the World Bank. He joined as a young professional, I'm told, way back in 1972, and he did several things with several countries. I mean, if I name those countries, it would take quite a time, but, to Romania, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Vietnam, Turkey. He was also the chief economist at Turkey. And he used to give structural adjustment loans and organize, and then he eventually moved to the EDI, the Development Institute of the World Bank, the Trading Institute, and he retired from the World Bank in 2000 after over a quarter of a century of a very illustrious career at the World Bank, in which he created several sort of partnerships, collaborations, both personal and institutional. And he also sort of worked in India at a critical time. His first sort of stint in India or engagement with India was in 1977 to 1979 with the Planning Commission, but then he came back during a critical time, and of course, Montek, who is pretty much regarded as one of the architects of India's reforms, Jayantada was there at that time in 1991 at the Ministry of Commerce as economic advisor, and he was part of the team that worked on comprehensive economic reforms during the liberalization. And he's been, he's been such a force in the area of trade reforms and trade facilitation. And I remember that he was a part of this Vijay Kelkar task force on indirect taxes, and he was responsible for the section devoted to reforms and customs processes. And I remember that we were discussing a project, and I think Arpita was also there, and Nisha from ICRIER, we were all there. It was in my room in the Habitat Center. We were discussing a project on trade facilitation and trade reforms. And this is something that he was so passionate about. And I remember he said, look, you guys, you keep talking about this database and that database and what will happen. I suggest that each of you go and sit in a warehouse, in a customs warehouse, for 2 days doing nothing but observing what is happening there. That will give you a much better idea of what goes on, and you'll be able to analyze the data much better than by just looking at the data. Don't do a primary survey, look at the secondary data, but go and sit in a customs warehouse for 2 days and don't ask questions, just observe. And I think that was, of course, very considered advice, and advice coming from an extremely experienced person. And I wonder whether I, of course, was unable to go, but I think Arpita and Nisha have been doing this for a long time. Over the last 20 years, Jayantada's columns, and I've been reading those columns in Business Standard, as I'm sure many of you have, and those columns had, every column had a message, and that message was extremely clear. We should have the confidence to engage with the global economy. We should not shy away from engaging with the global economy. And of course, to be able to engage better with the global economy, we need to be able to do domestic reform. We should do domestic reform. And all his articles ended up talking about what we're going to discuss in today's panel discussion, is the unfinished agenda of trade reforms. And he was a big votary for trade, free and fair trade. He was a big votary for logistics and trade facilitation reforms. And he was a big votary of trade reforms. And I think he has had a huge role, as I said, to play in India's economic reforms, especially since 1991, if not earlier. And he belonged to the generation of economists that had the privilege of having many of you here, of course, on the panel. Montek is here. He worked with Shankaracharya, Rakesh Mohan, Nitin Desai, Vijay Kelkar, Y.V. Reddy, and Bimal Jalan, to name just a few. So he's had, not only has he had a great cohort to have worked with, but he's had several individual contributions that he has made. So I'm not going to take too much more time. I'm sure the panel will also talk about their personal experiences with him and the intellectual force that he came with and presented in conversations and conversations that I've personally had with Jayantada, and I will really treasure them. And I'm really delighted that when Pritam Banerjee called me and said, Rajat, would you consider hosting a memorial in the honor of Jayantada, I immediately said yes, because I remembered all the good things that he has done, not only for the country, but for ICRIER and for me personally. This seminar would not have been possible without the support of Arpita, who is here and will deliver the vote of thanks, but also Tanu and Prateek. So thank you all for helping organize this seminar, and thank you for all the panelists for readily agreeing to speak at the memorial. And in conclusion, I can't help but think of a share by Iqbal, which fits Jayantada quite well. And it goes something like this. If I get it wrong, my apologies. Badi mushkil se hota hai chaman mein didavar paida. This is the second line. The first line goes like this. Hazaron saal nargis apni benuri pe roti hai. बड़ी मुश्किल से होता है इस चमन में दीदावर पैदा. And I think Jayantuda was certainly one of those. Thank you very much once again. Welcome to all of you. Let me hand it over to Aaditya Mattoo for further proceedings.
Thank you, Rajat, for inviting me to moderate this event. As you said, we are here today not to mourn the passing of a great man and a dear friend, but to celebrate his work. We have all benefited from Jayanta's warmth and generosity. We have been enlightened by his intellect and inspired by his integrity. Jayanta's voice, Jayanta's writings reverberate wherever there is a trade policy debate. And there is such a debate now. The openness that Jayanta helped to usher in can no longer be taken for granted. In the West, we see not just the aberration of a protectionist presidency, but what Montek has called an intellectual climate change, as some of the best minds favor a retreat from globalization. India reaped a huge growth dividend from opening up in the 1990s, but policy is now taking an inward turn as a new trade pessimism sets in. The World Trade Organization, where the three of us here, Harsha, Bernard, and I have worked in the vigorous and optimistic 1990s, today languishes aimlessly in the shadow of advancing regional agreements. In this somewhat depressing context, we miss Jayantada's voice. But his spirit is still with us, and I hope we can live up to his exacting standards of insight and integrity. To begin our conversation today, I'll ask Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Distinguished Fellow, Center for Social and Economic Progress, and former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission, with whom Jayanta worked in the 1990s, to begin our conversation today. Montek.
Thank you, Aditya. Let me join all of you in expressing, my great appreciation for ICRIER hosting this event, not just as a usual sort of sad memoriam function, but as a celebration of Jayanto's work. You know, I had the privilege of working with him in the government at that critical time when we were doing what we thought then were, and they were actually far-reaching trade reforms in 1991. I moved out of commerce very quickly, but I interacted with him in the Commerce Ministry when the first set of the trade reforms, which is the introduction of exim scripts and the liberalization of industrial licensing, took place. And, you know, he was, there's no question that his presence there in a bureaucracy that was otherwise very used to simply defending our position. You know, I think for a very long time, the Commerce Ministry was actually the ministry that liked to administer, if you like, both import restrictions and supporting measures for exports. It, curiously enough, never intellectually recognized that a lot of the import restrictions that it introduced were actually what made it necessary to have all kinds of export support. And that if we were to actually liberalize imports at one stroke, we would get rid of quite a lot of the reasons why exports needed all sorts of little help here and there. And Jayanta was very, very clear about this, and that was rare at that time. I mean, in some ways, you know, he probably had less, the role of economic advisors in the Commerce Ministry, as indeed in most ministries, is to provide an economic rationale for whatever the government is doing. I mean, this is not unusual in governments. I think one of the very iconic governors of the Bank of England was the first person to get an economic advisor. He hired someone from Cambridge. This was, I think, Montague, whatever. He said, "Look, let's get an economic advisor from Cambridge." And when this young man arrived, Sir Montague Norman said to him, "Young man, let's get one thing perfectly clear. Your job is not to give me advice. It is to advise the people on the correctness of whatever I'm doing." So this ancient sort of role of economic advisor survived for quite some time. And Jayanta was obviously not cast in that mold. And it was very refreshing to have someone who actually saw what needed to be done and didn't actually mind saying so. You know, in many ways, that was a time when lots of things got done very, very quickly. And then I think the momentum of trade reform slowed down quite a bit. Jayanta, of course, left. He left India at that time, shortly after the reforms began. But he wrote about trade policy from outside. And I must say that I share the view that Rajat has expressed that, you know, I mean, his whole approach to trade policy was not just based on standard trade theory, two-factor kind of models. I mean, he zeroed in very early in the day on the whole issue of logistical impediments to trade. And I just love that story about going to a warehouse, customs warehouse, and just looking at what happens. Because, you know, frankly, when I look back on it, I'm actually appalled at what an absurd system we were running. And I'm also appalled that we didn't change it earlier. I mean, it should have gone long ago, much earlier than it went. And it should have been wound up much faster than it was actually wound up. I mean, people don't realize this, but, you know, although we got rid of capital import licenses on capital goods and import licenses on intermediates very quickly, and I was fortunate in having moved to the finance ministry sometime in October or November of 1991. So just after Exim Scripts was introduced, I was in the finance ministry. And there we were kind of moving very quickly to replace Exim Scripts with the dual exchange rate and then unify the exchange rate. So it was an interesting case that we'd glorified the Exim Scripts as a wonderful invention of liberalization of trade, and then sort of within 6 months abolished it and called that a wonderful advancement towards trade liberalization through the exchange rate. And you know, Jayanta was a great source of strength through most of this period. Of course, once I moved to the finance ministry, I didn't have direct contact with him. But from his subsequent writings, I mean, his forthrightness in taking the positions he did, it's very important if you want a political debate to have someone at the extreme end. So actually, Jayanta provided a huge amount of cover, in a way, for the rest of us. Because when somebody said, "You're just a crazy trade liberalizer," you were able to say, no, we're actually very cautious. If you really want to trade liberalizer, look at what Jayanta is writing. And I mean, in fact, in many areas, he went beyond certainly what I would have thought at the time. He was in favor of signing an FTA with the United States. He was in favor of joining these tough FTAs, which went way beyond border trade measures and went into creating uniformity on behind the border trade regulations. And these were controversial issues at the time. You know, the Commerce Ministry and the Ministry of External Affairs for years viewed virtually any concession as a sacrifice of sovereignty. I mean, they had invented this utterly ridiculous phrase, policy space, as if whatever policy space you could maintain, which really meant a sovereign right to muck up your policies in a manner that would thoroughly damage the economy, that it was worth doing. And I used to argue with them that, look, I mean, this is simply not true. Jayanto was the person outside the government who constantly articulated this point of view. I really regret that he wasn't in India because, in order to make an impact on policy, you have to be here. It's very easy to dismiss the point of view if the person expressing it happens to be abroad. But I don't think this ever discouraged Jayanto, and he would write unhesitatingly what he believed in. And interestingly, I found it was very helpful because many people thought his stuff was very helpful, even if they weren't actually willing to go that far. So I think this is in a governmental process. You need people who are, as it were, at the outside edge, because they help to define the parameters within which the debate takes place. And I think he was prescient, in my view, in focusing on logistics at a time when most of us were still worried about not having completed the tariff reduction process. I mean, that, after all, we had introduced in 1993, I think, Dr. Manmohan Singh was persuaded to say in his speech, budget speech as finance minister, that the longer term objective for tariffs is to bring them down to ASEAN levels. I mean, before that, the Chelaya committee had basically said, we got to lower them. But the level at which they wanted them lowered was actually quite high. And of course, during this period, everybody else was busily lowering tariffs. So it was Dr. Manmohan Singh who first said that our longer term objective must be to lower them to ASEAN levels. Then when you had the United Front government, we managed to get Mr. Chidambaram, who of course was a liberalizer himself, to actually raise the ante and say that, we must bring them down to ASEAN levels within 3 years. Of course, the United Front government didn't last for more than 2 years. So he wasn't there in the 3rd year. But to his credit, Yashwant Sinha, as a finance minister, also endorsed this broad approach. But in spite of all that, what is not realized is that we never liberalized trade in consumer goods. I mean, all our trade liberalization was capital goods and intermediates. And consumer goods remained strictly controlled. I remember my very limited occasion when I suppose I could say I was doing something bold, is the Commerce Ministry was fighting a case in WTO against India for maintaining quantitative restrictions, which in the WTO are not allowed except for balance of payments reasons. They're not allowed as an instrument of protection. Aditya will correct me if I'm wrong. He knows more about this. But the circumstances under which you can put in quantitative restrictions very limited. And of course, our chap said, no, we can't manage the balance of payments, so we have to have them. So I received a letter from the then Commerce Secretary that, look, we're going to argue in Geneva that India needs these restrictions for balance of payments reasons. And will you please confirm that from the Finance Ministry? So I couldn't resist writing a letter saying I completely disagreed with this view and it was against the interests of the nation. And that as a matter of fact, we've just overcome a major balance of payments crisis. We are going around the world trying to invite foreign investment and assuring them that the structural changes that we've made are permanent. And any problem with the balance of payments is going to be handled by FDI and a flexible exchange rate. So I do not agree with your view that we need this. And I also pointed out that, you know, the only three countries that had it at the time were North Korea, Cuba, and I think Outer Mongolia or some such thing. So, you know, that was the atmosphere. But never, and we lost that particular case. So the WTO ruled that our restrictions were not legitimate. But the ministry wanted to negotiate the longest possible period to get rid of them. And in the end, I remember a meeting telling Mr. Vajpayee that, look, we should just get rid of them. This doesn't make any sense at all. And I said, look, if you want a little bit of protection, you can always do it through tariffs because you have a lot of room. But get rid of this. But he said, no, the Commerce Ministry has negotiated up to 2002. So we will do what the International Tribunal says, but we'll only do it in 2002. So it's not until 2002, long after the economic reforms, etc., that we were able to get rid of quantitative restrictions on consumer goods. And this despite the fact that innumerable expert committees had said that we have lost out in competitiveness in a whole lot of simple consumer goods because we reserve the damn things for the small scale sector, which cannot expand and therefore cannot expand its investment beyond a level and therefore cannot ensure either the scale of production or the level of quality. So, you know, I think basically Jayanto had a deep understanding of what was wrong. And from outside, he, as it were, laid out a much clearer set of signals on where we needed to go. I wish he had been with us here, if not in government, at least outside, because it is true that somehow we've evolved a culture in which if you're saying something abroad, then maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be right. And that's pity. That was there even then. I wonder how much more progress we would have made if Jayanto had been here in India. But whatever it is, he contributed continuously, and when one looks back, contributed in exactly the right areas. And I think that's now being realized, and you know, we're sort of making some efforts to follow in those footsteps. But I just wish we would do it a lot faster. So with those words, let me thank you, Rajat, for inviting me. And let me certainly endorse the view that we have lost a very innovative and for India, a very relevant policy economist. He wasn't a neoclassical trade theorist finding interesting variations on standard trade theory. He was really very much someone who looked at what happened around the world and could address the question, why are other countries doing so much better than we are? And his research strategy of going to the customs house and looking at what actually happens is honestly something which probably still valid today. And I hope you're getting ICRIER staff to do more of it even now and in future. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Montek, for such a rich description of Jayanta's engagement in the Indian policy discourse and reform implementation. You know, as you said, many of us are often right, but rarely bold. It is now fashionable to be bold without the underpinnings of intellectual rigor, which would ensure that you're right. And Jayanta was one of the few people who was both bold and right, but perhaps ahead of his time, and in many ways. And many of the things that he said with conviction are turning out to be as relevant today as when he first said them. I also, can empathize with this. His heart was often in India, but he lived here, and I can empathize with this struggle to live between these two countries, and but he did it more gracefully and with greater impact than most of us ever will. Let me now turn to Bernard Hoekman, who worked with Jayanta very closely. I've heard stories about the two of them bargaining for carpets in Egypt, or was it another part of the Middle East? Bernard is professor and director of Global Economics at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies of the European University Institute in Florence. Bernard, over to you.
Thank you. So I met Jayanta sometime in the mid-1990s when we were both at the World Bank, and I can only echo what has been said so far, that if you think about Jayanta, on the one hand, someone who is extremely passionate about what he's doing and what he's trying to get other people to do, but at the same time also very practical, right? So as Montek said, Jayanta was not a theorist, even though he has a PhD from Berkeley, so he certainly knew his economics. But I think I know quite a bit of what Jayanta did, mainly because I went on a lot of missions with him, right? And the ironic thing about working for a place like the World Bank is you actually get to know each other when you're out of Washington and when you're on the road, because we tend to spend at least half of our life on the road, and a lot of that time is spent with each other. So just to give you a few kind of illustrations of both the passion and the pragmatism of Jayanta at work, which I think was clearly you see that reflected in all of his columns and his engagement in India. But of course, I know all of that secondhand, but I saw a lot of this kind of active engagement firsthand in a large number of the countries we worked on together. So just as an example, so one of the things Jayanta would always do when we arrive in a country is look very carefully at how the immigration process works, right? So it's straight off the plane. And he's taking notes about how are we treated, not just we individually, but how are people welcomed into the country, right? How long are the lines? How long does it take? How are visitors treated? And in particular, he was very, very focused on how large is the entry card that you have to fill in. Because in his view was, if you can't stick it in your front pocket, you've already lost points in terms of facilitating entry and getting into the country. Then when you go and see the minister of the country involved the next day, and Jayanta was leading these missions, the first thing he would say is, I have some of these first world types here who of course are going to lecture you and who think they know better. And he points at me. But let me tell you, coming from the third world, I know what we need to do. I know exactly where you're coming from. I know the constraints you're under. But let me tell you, there's a lot of simple things you can do from the get-go, which has nothing to do with changing policies. It's just all about implementation, administrative processes, right? And I think this was one of the key features of the practical Jayanta in terms of, what can you actually do to make things move across the border faster? What can you do, to make things work better? There's also a big kind of anti-corruption dimension to this, but he would engage on the first meeting immediately with the minister and his advisors and say, okay, here's 5 things you can do right now. Why don't you do them? What's the problem? And whatever problems there are, I'm here to help you fix it, right? And we're not going to talk about complicated structural adjustment or tariff reforms. Let's start with the simple stuff. And the simple stuff is actually really important. And then the next day we would indeed go to the port, right? And we would spend a lot of time in the port. We would spend a lot of time in the customs houses. And one of the things we're looking for is, what are these people doing? To what extent are bribes being paid? Can we figure out how the system works? In a sense of getting a handle on the political economy in these relevant countries. One of his kind of standard recommendations and action items in many of the countries we worked in was, again, very pragmatic. And he said, what you need as a minister, as a policymaker, you need to measure. You need to be able to understand whether you're making a difference, whether things are improving, right? So let's measure how long it takes for a consignment to get through customs. So in a sense, he was actually ahead of the doing business idea. He was doing that on the trade front already very early on, before doing business even existed. And one of his pet kind of recommendations was create targets for exporters, reward exporters. If you have a company that's actually doing well, give them a star on their forehead, publicize it, put them in the newspaper, give them a medal. And so you create an incentive for actually export-oriented production and generate the growth channel through that dimension. So again, a lot of practical focus on how to actually make things better as opposed to theory. One of the stories he told me in terms of what he did early on in the World Bank, and this is the kind of thing you otherwise would never know unless somebody tells you. So he built the national accounts for Afghanistan in the early 1970s, right? And he did it by purely estimating and guesstimating economic activity in Afghanistan using techniques which I think are still being used in a much more fancy way nowadays with GPS positioning and looking at lights at night in terms of how much energy consumption there is in the country. But he was doing that in the 70s in Afghanistan, of course, without all of that technology, but again, very pragmatically, going to the market, getting a sense of, okay, what are these particular P's being sold for? How can I kind of convert that into a price index? And then how can we use that to help build the national account? So again, very pragmatic, very, very hands-on. I think on the trade facilitation logistics topic that we're kind of talking about here today, I think one of the kind of, this clearly has become kind of completely conventional, right? So we have now a trade facilitation agreement in the WTO. We have a huge effort going on by the multilateral development banks to actually support trade facilitation initiatives in, it must be over 100 developing countries around the world. And I think one of the things Jayanta was kind of focused on, which we also now see embedded in the WTO trade facilitation agreement, and in a sense is best practice now for countries to do, is to create committees that cut across the different line ministries, right? So that we don't just think about this as a customs problem, we don't just think about this as a logistics problem, but there's a finance dimension to it, there's a storage dimension to it. So you need to bring together all of the actors in a country to think about where are the frictions, where are the constraints. And Jayanta was always very cognizant of the fact that this is a very dynamic problem, right? So we can think we fix something on customs by tariff simplification, by reducing administrative procedures, but then something else pops up, right? So it might be an issue that has to do with product standards. It might be an issue that has to do with inspection of containers for radiation purposes or national security or what have you. So you need to bring all of those actors together. And the notion of a committee, a council, and in particular one that goes all the way to the top, is something that he was always very keen on, in terms of we need to rope in Ministry of Finance, Prime Minister's office, President's office, because they have a broader perspective. You need to take this away from the line ministries. Line ministries, of course, are responsible for implementation, but you cannot leave it to them to actually drive a process, especially a dynamic process of trying to help improve trade facilitation performance. And I think that's something you saw very clearly in a lot of the columns he was writing with respect to India, but it's something that he was very much focused on in terms of the advice he was giving to countries that he worked on. And I think that is something which is still, of course, a huge challenge in virtually any country in terms of this interministerial, interagency type of coordination. But it is something that I think he picked up on very early, and it's certainly something I learned from him in terms of implementation of reform processes. It's not just enough to try and figure out what you need to do in terms of creating the right incentive structure. It's really mostly actually, it's about focusing on the administrative mechanisms and processes that you have to deal with if you're going to implement. And this is something that many economists pay no attention to at all. right? I mean, it's simply not part of the DNA, but it was very much something that he put front and center in terms of his thinking. And I think it's something that is going to continue to be with us for a while. But I think what we see nowadays in many countries in terms of these national trade facilitation committees, I mean, I would argue that's something Jayanta was trying to push through way before it became fashionable. And it's something that I think he was clearly ahead of the curve in terms of focusing on that practicality. One last little story about Jayanta. When he retired from the bank, he spent some time teaching at Santa Cruz, so the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I remember him having great fun telling me how he was standing up there in front of all these left-wing kids who were all anti-globalization, and he was beating them up every time he was giving a lecture, challenging them to say, what is wrong with this? Let me tell you this story. Let me tell you that story. How do you think that country actually came to double its per capita income over the past 10 years, right? It's all because they're integrating into the global economy. And then he would challenge them saying, you have something against developing countries growing? You know, you need to reflect upon what you're saying. So he really, I think he had a lot of fun when he was there in Santa Cruz. I don't know how the kids internalized it, but because he was so charming, I'm convinced that everybody came away convinced, or at least thinking a lot more about what the preconceptions they had in their head. And that was something that really he had that very strongly in terms of being able to engage, make it personable, and you know, this passion really comes through. He'll be sorely missed. Thanks, Aaditya.
Thank you, Bernard. I think you reminded me of the twinkle that was always in his eye. And even as he engaged on the most contentious issues, it was always with good humor and passion. Thank you. I turn now to Harsha Singh, Chairman, IKDHVAJ Advisors and former Executive Director of Brookings India, former Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and forever a friend for me and for Jayanta and for all of us. In fact, Harsha, I don't know if you remember, I was still working in the World Trade Organization when I first heard of Jayanta from you as this wonderful man who worked in the World Bank and was doing amazing work. Harsha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Aaditya. I do remember that, and so many more stories. A lot of substantive points and reminiscences have been shared with us by the two illustrious speakers who came before me. And they actually show a number of aspects of Jayanta Da. And yes, I always called him Jayanta Da because I considered him as an elder brother and he considered me a younger one. Talking about his is emotional for me, but hopefully I'll make sense when I'm talking. So, you know, both the speakers before me have said how Jayanta Da was ahead of his time, and they've given several examples. I saw that in so many ways, including the ones which have been shared. For example, what Bernard talked about, it shows that much before we realize that trade policy is not only at the border, trade policy is also behind the border. Jayanta Da was actually addressing that, what we call industrial policy today or investment policy. In addition to that, he also realized that we have to function in the environment outside the country. It's not as if we can just function based on what we are focusing on inside the country, because when we are looking at policies to improve our competitiveness, it's also to compete with others who are operating in the global market. So the global developments become very important. I had a large project on TPP and India. I knew that India can never be a part of what was TPP and is now CPTPP, largely similar to TPP. But what both he and I realized is that the world is going to change as a result of a trade agreement like TPP or CPTPP. And to operate efficiently in that changed world, what should India be doing? Even when he was not very well, he actually insisted on coming to New Delhi to a conference, a concluding conference I had organized, to share his views on that. That was his energy, that was his passion. He was somebody who, as already indicated, recognized early on that policy making was not just in making policies, it was also efficiently implementing them. And that's something which we sorely miss focusing on within India too. It's work in progress in most places, but to the extent you actually want to make policy, a good policy, into an efficient policy, the implementation part becomes very important. And in terms of policy monitoring and implementation, he also recognized the role of institutions. So he's written quite a lot on how should certain institutional forms of government be established, whether they be in terms of policy formulation, policy implementation, interaction, coordination, oversight, etc. The thing which really surprised me about Jayantada, and surprised me pleasantly, and I benefited from it, was that he had a perspective of the forest. He knew where the trees were located and where the boulders were. And he actually gave you a path ahead in very concrete, practical terms. He identified issues which needed to be tackled. Of course, he and I agreed on 90-95% of the issues. The 5 or 10% where we differed, it was mainly in terms of the practicality of currently managing to do what he was aiming at. He had great ambition, great hope for the country. He was completely in love with India and recognized the potential and wanted it to happen today. And Dr. Montek Ahluwalia has already talked about how some of the processes were more based on trying to hold on to what was existing rather than change rapidly to a new normal, be it with a big bang or otherwise. He actually kept thinking how to make it happen. So one of his thoughts was, perhaps if we sign on to an FTA, like what China did by joining the WTO, acceding to it, and basically driving its reform process through the membership and the promises it made at WTO. Perhaps India too could use these kind of tools and mechanisms to drive internal reform, not only through learning from outside the successful experiences, etc., but also in some sense tying the hands, but in a manner where the policy could be sustained and implemented without losing oxygen or momentum. That was a thought which preoccupied him, because he knew that there were very smart thinkers in India. He also knew that inertia would be one of the major blocks to overcome. And the path which he charted, it involved major interlinked changes, institutions, coordination mechanism, governance, plus levers which you have to pull or push. And in that context, he saw the emerging trade regulatory system as something which we could not avoid operating in. Therefore, if we have to really function in that system, we must incorporate domestic reform in such a way that we don't lose out to others as far as markets are concerned. He recognized that exports had played a big role in India's growth, For example, in 2000, the share of Indian merchandise exports, goods exports, was 0.7% of world trade. It grew, world trade on average, the next 10 years or so grew double-digit rates annually. And India, in that environment, increased its share of world trade from 0.7 to 1.7. Since 2011, it has sort of stuck there. And Jayantada's whole aspiration was, how can we give a major push again to a part of activity in India which gets incentivized by interacting with the rest of the world through policy changes which are entirely within our control? What are the priority areas we can talk about? And that's where he hooked on to the global value chain, trade facilitation, looking at practical implementation issues, etc. So in some sense, he was a planner, implementer in a theoretical sense, leave alone the part he played in the Indian government earlier and in all other government policies which he was involved in as a World Bank economist. But he really wanted to identify the key areas which are obstacles and then point out to the ways in which they could actually be addressed using his immense experience across so many countries. Bernard has given some very interesting stories of the way he did it. That was not possible for him to do it in India, but he has contributed in laying out that framework. Dr. Ahluwalia talked about how on logistics, he had anticipated the issues much earlier. The report, which is with the government now on what to do, has a stamp also of Jayantada's thinking and inputs. Similarly, a lot of thought processes which go on in trade facilitation or ease of doing business. But even when, say, we have improved our ranking in ease of doing business and various other indices, even when we think of how we are doing better than before, what Jayantada used to say is, we have to not do better on average. We have to do better than those who are our competitors. And what are they doing right? Can we learn from them? Can we do better than that? And I did a small exercise recently. I took a few developed economies and Asia Pacific and some specific economies in East Asia. So there were, including India, there were 9 different economies. And then if you take an index of various parts of, say, trade facilitation, India is the last, so 9th out of 9th in 2 parts, just comparing these competing economies. 8th out of in 2 areas, and 7th or in another 2 areas or so. So we basically, if we had to improve our position in terms of what we ought to be doing if we do things right, we have to focus on much more targeted aspects than just a broad index. That's the kind of insight he brought in. The other insight was that scale becomes very important. If you see all the major players in world trade, they have investments, FDI, etc., with large scale. And if you have protectionist regimes, say tariffs or quotas, those regimes act against scale. Even if there is tariff jumping investment, the Indian market is not large enough to create a global export hub. It has been created in certain instances, but on a much larger scale, which can be done. So how do we manage this combination? Those were the kind of issues he dealt with. He provided solutions, and it's useful to go back to his writings to get inspired and also solutions to the issues which I've just touched upon. Thank you again, Aaditya.
Thank you very much, Harsh. That was a really rich portrait of Jayanta and his engagement. I will turn now to Dr. Sanjay Baru, who's the director of the Geo-Economics and Strategy, the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. Sanjay.
Thank you, Dr. Mattoo. Sorry, that was my old position, which I ended in 2016. I'm no longer with IISS. I'm not affiliated to any organization now. I'm retired and writing. Let me join all of you in paying tribute to Jayanta Roy, a dear friend for all of us. I first met him when he was economic advisor in the Commerce Ministry, when I was an editor at the Economic Times in the early 90s, and have over the years been in touch with him, interacted with him, not as intimately as many of you, because I was always in India, and he was, after his stint with the Commerce Ministry, he had moved back to the US, and I've never spent any time in the US. So therefore, my association with him was largely through correspondence. But many years later, in 2018, when I was the Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FICCI, he came to meet me. My colleague at that time and my successor now, who's the Secretary General, Dilip Chinoy, who's also, I believe, with us today this evening. Dilip and I met with Jayanta, and he came to us with a request. He was doing a paper for the Ministry of Commerce, which for a brief period had a very open-minded pro-liberalization minister in Suresh Prabhu. He was preceded and succeeded by the more Swadeshi Jagran Manch types. But Suresh was someone who always known as a reformer. He initiated power sector reforms during Vajpayee's time. And Suresh invited Jayanta to do a paper on trade policy reform. And he came to us in FICCI wanting access to some of our members to do precisely the kind of thing that Mr. Hoekman, Bernard Hoekman, spoke about, getting into the nitty-gritty issues, talking to actual industrialists, talking to businessmen, what are the kind of things that they were looking for. And we facilitated some of that interaction. So I completely go along with the points made by both Harsha and Mr. Hoekman, that Jayanta was someone who had his feet on the ground. He had the finger on the pulse, if you like. He understood the real world. He understood how the real world, the real economy functioned. And therefore, his ideas, even if they were radical, even if they were ahead of the time, they were not woolly. They were not manufactured out of thin air. They were not purely ideological or theoretical, but very much based on a practical understanding of things. So that is a point all of you have made, which I fully endorse. My most recent interaction with him, which went on and on till a few weeks before he passed away, was when I invited him to contribute a chapter to a book that I edited. It's called Beyond COVID Shadow, published a couple of months back by Hoekman, which is a collection of about 20 essays on the impact of the COVID lockdown, the impact of the pandemic on the Indian economy, and the trade and the economic policy solutions going forward. What is it that India should do, what the government should do? And quite understandably, I asked Jayanta to do the chapter on trade policy. So his chapter, which is really in the goes along with what one would expect from him, was down to practical detail. So let me just spend 2 minutes reading out the core of his ideas on trade facilitation, because the focus of this chapter was, apart from trade policy reform and tariff reform, was essentially on trade facilitation with a view to enable India to be more actively engaged in global value chains. The focus was on global value chains, and that how after the pandemic and thanks to the US-China trade war, etc., um, international business is looking for new locations, and how India should be part of the global, what all of us read these days. And Jayantada's paper was about trade facilitation with a view to enable India to be part of global value chains. So let me quickly read some of his ideas, because I think that's far more useful to those of you who are listening to us here and who may not have yet seen this book. Um, I'll just read out some 20 recommendations of this. Rationalize rail tariff and expedite commissioning of dedicated freight corridors. Fast track elimination of container freight stations and inland container depots by pushing direct port delivery and direct port export. Nudge shipping lines to institute a transparent tariff structure. Ensure a seamless and efficient road transport experience. Introduce a one nation, one permit, one tax system for movement of goods across the country by road. Make business processes uniform and standardize gate in and gate out approvals and documentation processes at ports. 24/7 shipping line services to trade. Digitize and assess automatic digitization. Assess the pace of automatic digitization. Border trade facilitation, fully facilitate trade, trust-based clearance processes through modern risk management systems. Fully automated paperless trade environment with minimum face-to-face interaction. Single window digital portal integrating all stakeholders. Monitor all key outposts across all major gateways. Physical inspection of goods to be only an exception. Train officers to operate, manage the new system. Implement audit-based controls with the use of information technology. Popularize advanced bills of entry. Authorize economic operators in the private sector. Target cargo dwell time to reach levels comparable to successful Southeast Asian countries. Establish a National Council of Logistics and Trade Facilitation outside the line ministries and reporting directly to the Prime Minister. And that this council should consist of cabinet ministers of the ministries and departments related to logistics and trade facilitation, and the chief ministers of concerned states. Private sector and trade stakeholders should be represented on this. Logistics wing presently under the Commerce Ministry be made a dedicated secretariat. Incidentally, I think this has happened. Development of robust performance outcomes for logistics and trade facilitation. Monitor performance through an online dashboard and fix responsibilities for time-bound corrective action. Facilitate policy development and multi-stakeholder coordination. Regular publication and dissemination of data on key sectoral outputs, and so on and so forth. I was just reading this out to give you a flavor of the kind of detail that he went to in an essay which is on trade policy, on the importance of India's integration into the global value chain system. He has a whole section on the benefits of India being inside the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, inside the CPTP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Pacific Partnership. Harshvardhan mentioned that this was something that Jayantada had been speaking for a long time. And in fact, in my own conversations with him while he was writing this essay, we spoke once or twice on the phone. He kept criticizing the government of India for walking out of RCEP. And this was a subject on which we agreed, because I had also written columns saying that we should have remained within RCEP, taken our own time to actually join, but not walked out of it. And in this chapter, he reiterates the point. Finally, he was convinced, as is already mentioned, but he dedicated an entire section at the end of that essay. He was convinced that unless reform is led from the top, unless the Prime Minister of India presides over a trade policy committee, trade policy reform left to the Commerce Ministry will never move forward. And this was something that he very seriously believed in, and recommends the creation of a trade policy reform committee directly under the Prime Minister, with officers in the PMO monitoring it, etc. So I thought I should just read this out because this was the last piece of his writing before he passed away. I think after this, his health deteriorated. I was getting frantic emails from him saying, I've not yet received a copy of the book. And I had to push the publishers to fly the book across because I think it was being sent by sea, or I don't know how it was being sent. So finally the book reached him. And within a few weeks after that, I received the email of his passing away. That was very, very sad. Thank you, ICRIER, for inviting me to join this commemoration of Jayantada's memory. He was someone that all of us were fond of, and he was a very dear friend. And we hope his soul rests in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. I would now like to invite any of the other people to intervene briefly, perhaps beginning with Preetham. And if I can request you all to mute. Preetham, I know how much you loved Jayantada, what a wonderful mentor he was for you, as for many of us. Do you want to say a few words?
Thanks, Aditya. I think I will not say much because, as you know, I'll get very emotional because Dr. Roy for me was more than just a mentor. I know whatever little I have achieved in life is entirely due to his mentoring, what he taught me. And I think I'll just say one thing here that would sum it up. When I was a complete greenhorn straight out of my master's program in JNU, I had joined the CII where he was at that time working. And it was precisely that kind of mentoring where he taught me to think outside books and look at the real world in different ways to try and figure things out on my own. And he was at that time member of the working group on trade facilitation that had just been formed. And I made many trips to customs houses, to dry ports and other places with him. And that's how I learned a lot of my own trade. And, for me, it's a large part of who I am, I think, is with Dr. Roy. So thank you very much. I'd like to really express my gratitude to ICRIER, to Rajat, to Arpita Di, and to all of you for, doing this. Thank you so much. I'll end there.
Thank you, Preetham. And I think in your writings, you have carried forward Jayantada's legacy very well. Anybody else who would like to say a few words?
Is there a way to unmute? I think all the other participants are not able to unmute themselves.
Preetham, I think that's being controlled by somebody in ICRIER.
It has been unmuted.
Already requested.
Are participant able to speak? They have unmuted.
I think Nitin Desai has written something. You may want to read that out if possible, either Aditya or Arpita.
Please, Arpita, can you do that?
Yes, please. Let me just take it out. Nitin Desai has written that Jayanta was an easy person to work with because of his humor, civility, and the clarity of his views and how he expressed them. He was a charming friend whose company was always a delight. He works on trade policy, which included practical dimensions like logistics, and that work was outstanding. We will miss him, but we must also celebrate what he has achieved in shaping the trade policy of India. More than that, he is thankful for his friendship. I mean, it's amazing that his friendship has been referred to in the note by most of the people over the years. Thank you, Aditya. There is also Bernard has to leave for some reasons, and there may be other participants who would like to speak. Somebody from World Bank or Deloitte or from other organizations.
Arpita, let me ask you to say a few words now.
Thank you, Aditya. On behalf of ICRIER, it actually gives me a lot of honor and pleasure to host this event for Jayantada. When I joined ICRIER and we were doing this, Aditya, remember this huge project on trade in services, and I had no clue on all this service sector. And Dr. Ahluwalia took me to Jayantada and said, Jayanta, this is your student, and Arpita, this is your guru. And since then, our journey began. And he always used to tell me, Aditya, that you should do good quality research like Aditya, but you should also be able to justify your research like Aditya does, very strongly, and confirm it very firmly. And therefore, Aditya, it is a pleasure for us to have you today. Thank you for moderating this session. Dr. Roy always had a very soft corners for what he calls the Ahluwalias, and he told me that if ever anything happens to me, you should ensure that you inform Montek. And when I got the news, the first person that I called actually was Ayush, so that Montek sir has the news. Thank you, Montek sir, for being here, because this is what he always wanted, towards the fag end of his days. He referred to Bernard as my good friend Bernard, and amazingly, that even towards his fag end, he wanted to do more research with Bernard, and his ideas used to be, most recent ideas was how to look at India expanding through Middle East into Africa and whatnot, and he was very scared that he would forget these ideas, and he used to call us at 6 o'clock in the evening, and from 6 to 10 o'clock or 12 o'clock, he used to make me write down those ideas. So if ever this research come up, we have Dr. Roy with us. Thank you, Bernard, for being here. Harsha, I already mentioned today that he was reading your latest work on subsidies with a lot of interest as India was coming out with the trade policy review. He was looking forward to the review. He has always admired your work, your frankness, and we also discussed how you handholded me at one point in time on the telecom sector. Thank you for being here. Being a part of this event of ICRIER. Sanjay, Dr. Roy always told us that, today there is nothing called trade. If you don't understand geopolitics, there is no trade. So you have to link trade and geopolitics in this world, and you cannot be an economist alone. And in this context, he referred to a lot of your work, and it has been a pleasure to have you in our ICRIER platform. I am really grateful for so many participants, many of whom I have connected through Dr. Roy. I could see Arindam and others, and many of them who has been part of our journey of research, hand-holding ICRIER researchers to do, well in their research. I am especially grateful to Preetham. This event is conceptualized by Preetham, and it could not have been possible without three or four people. That Preetham conceptualized it, Rajat, happily took it over, gave it to his most capable team, Tanu and Prateek and Manmeet, to actually, and his team to carry it forward. They enthusiastically did it. And that's why we are here together. Most important, and I must bring forward the last word of Dr. Ray that he spoke to me in February, that we need to continue to do good quality research. We need to be bold. But we should not be scared about losing our jobs when we make recommendations to the government. We need to be bold. We need to start, we need to continue to publish, and we need to always think about India first when we do our jobs and think about the best interest of the country. He also felt that, future research and logistics should be data driven, and we need to focus on more IT implementation, data driven research. Given that technology will enable us to collect a lot of data, he felt that all this custom process and other issues, if we actually put in a best quality risk management system, much of these issues will be resolved much faster. And given India's strength in the IT, he wanted this to be looked into as a future trade facilitation issue in India. Also, he had a lot of passion for e-commerce and how e-commerce related cross-border trade barriers can be addressed. And that is an area, I think, of which will fall under this unfinished trade agenda of his, along with market diversification and making India ready to do trade agreements. According to him, trade agreements were not important in the sense of signing as many agreements as you want to, and shallow agreements. It was more important in terms of using them to actually implement domestic reforms and moving forward. I thank you all for being here. I am especially grateful to all the attendees, all the ICRIER team for organizing this, and all of you for being here today. I hope you all the best and a good evening and good morning wherever you are.
Thank you, Arpita.
Thank you.
I'm touched by what you said, and I think it is absolutely true. Jayanta's generosity towards all his friends is memorable. I want to conclude by reading something that Kishore Rao has written. He says that this was such an amazing tribute to the finest of men. And he says what made him this even better was his intellect, charm, and his authenticity, and that twinkle in his eyes. I never met someone so eminent, yet humble and practical. I learned so much from him, especially the need to be bold and passionate in your ideas and actions. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. I'd like to thank Rajat and ICRIER for organizing this tribute. And as you said, Arpita, to Preetam for having conceiving of this whole.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaditya. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.